Winter in the windy city is never kind to those with nowhere to go. The bitter, bone-chilling wind cuts through every alleyway, showing no mercy to anyone without four walls for shelter. Among the many lost souls drifting through the city was a young boy named Mason, 16 years old, homeless, alone, with no one to rely on but himself. Mason had learned how to survive in the hidden corners of Chicago. The warm air vents behind shopping centers, the dimly lit corners of 24-hour laundromats, and, on nights of sheer desperation, the cold, hard benches at the L train station became his resting places. 4 months ago, Mason had walked away from the place that should have been his safe haven, a home that had turned into a living hell under the hands of an abusive uncle. And yet, Mason refused to let his circumstances define him. He didn't beg for pity, nor did he surrender to fate. By day, he blended into the crowd, wearing the cleanest clothes he had, sneaking showers at a community centre so no one would suspect he was homeless. He hustled for every penny, carrying groceries for the elderly, washing car windows at intersections, and sometimes just collecting bottles and cans to recycle. Every single dime he made went toward the one thing that mattered most to him: his education. The public library was where Mason found a small sense of stability. Every day, he sat in front of a computer screen, fully immersed in online courses, as if they were the only way to escape the darkness surrounding his life. He refused to let his past consume him, refused to let the cold or the cruelty of the streets dictate his fate. But winter nights were still the hardest, the long, freezing nights when everyone else had gone home, leaving only the lost souls like him drifting through the shadows. One such night, weak from hunger and with only a handful of coins in his pocket, Mason stepped into a fast food restaurant in search of warmth. He pushed open the heavy glass door of a McDonald's, and a wave of heat immediately wrapped around him like a temporary blanket. He took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of hot fries and fresh-baked buns, smells that only made his stomach ache more. Mrs. Chun, the night shift manager, looked at him with a familiar expression, a quiet kind of concern, free of pity. They had an unspoken agreement. As long as Mason bought something, he could stay for a while without being bothered. He counted the coins in his pocket, trying not to let his hands shake from hunger. 1 small fries and a hamburger, he said softly. Mrs. Chun nodded, but when she handed him the tray, she quietly placed a cup of hot chocolate beside it. "It's a cold night," she said simply. Mason didn't know how to respond except with a grateful nod. He took the tray, found a quiet corner, and sat down. Just as he was about to take his first bite, a soft sound came from outside the window. A small figure sat on the ledge, a thin, stray cat with pale orange fur. Its ears drooped, its tangled coat telling the story of too many nights spent in the cold. Its eyes locked onto Mason through the glass. Wary, yet filled with a familiar kind of hunger. Mason sighed. He knew that feeling all too well. Slowly, he picked up half of his hamburger and stepped outside, ignoring the icy wind that whipped against his face. "Hey, you looking for something to eat too?" he murmured, kneeling down and placing a piece of the burger in front of the cat. It hesitated for a moment before suddenly pouncing, grabbing the piece, and retreating a few steps. It chewed slowly, as if it couldn't believe that someone was willing to share food with it. Mason chuckled, a rare sound from him. "You're just as cautious as I am," he muttered. But what surprised him the most was that after finishing the food, the cat didn't run away. It stared at him for a moment, then stepped closer, rubbing against his leg before curling up beside him, as if deciding he was the safest place to be. Mason sat there, staring down at the small creature that had somehow placed its trust in him. He didn't know why, but something inside him softened. For the first time in months, he felt just a little less alone. He reached out, gently running his fingers through its rough, tangled fur. "I guess, tonight, we're friends," he whispered. Back inside, Mason sat in his corner, his hot chocolate growing cold in his hands as he silently watched the world outside. Under the table, the stray orange cat, who he had already decided to call Buddy, was curled up at his feet, its eyes half closed in contentment. The jingle of the doorbell cut through the quiet. A gust of freezing air swept in as a woman stepped inside. Elegant in appearance, her silver hair neatly styled, her expensive cashmere coat dusted with glistening snowflakes. She looked like she had rushed to get here, her eyes scanning the room with a sense of urgency. Mrs. Chun paused from wiping the counter and looked up. "Looking for something, Mrs. Wellington?" The woman nodded, concern flickering in her gaze. "I'm looking for my cat. A small orange tabby, wearing an old blue collar. Someone said they saw him around here." Mason felt a slight tightening in his chest. He glanced down at Buddy, and now, looking closer, he finally noticed it. The faded collar nearly hidden beneath the cat's matted fur. His heart sank. Buddy had a home. He didn't know why, but that realization made his chest ache in a way he wasn't prepared for. Mrs. Chun glanced over at Mason and gestured subtly toward his table. "There's a cat here." The woman, Margaret Wellington, turned, her sharp eyes scanning Mason before landing on Buddy. Her lips trembled slightly. "Oliver," she whispered, almost as if she couldn't believe it. Buddy, or Oliver, lifted his head, but instead of immediately running toward the woman in a dramatic reunion, he rubbed his head against Mason's leg first, as if checking to make sure the boy was okay. Only then did he slowly walk over to Margaret. She knelt down, completely unconcerned about her expensive coat, and gently ran her fingers through his scruffy fur. "Oh, my sweet boy, where have you been?" Her voice cracked, relief and emotion intertwining. Mason sat still, his hands clenched together. He had known all along that he had to let Buddy go, but the way the cat hesitated before leaving, the way it brushed against his leg one last time as if to say thank you, it left him feeling strangely hollow. Margaret looked up at Mason, her gaze lingering on him like someone who had learned to see the things others tried to hide. The worn-out coat, the chapped hands from the cold, the defensive posture of someone always bracing for the worst. She understood immediately. Her voice was gentle. "You took care of him, didn't you?" Mason shrugged, looking away. "He was hungry," he said simply. Margaret was silent for a moment, as if considering something. Then she smiled, not the polite, distant kind that wealthy people often wore, but a genuine, warm smile. "You did a wonderful thing. I think that deserves a proper thank you." Mason frowned. "That's not necessary. No one should turn down a decent meal." Margaret stood, brushing snow off her coat. "There's a diner just down the street that's open all night. Come on, let me buy you a real dinner." Mason opened his mouth to refuse, but before he could say anything, Mrs. Chun, who had been quietly watching the whole exchange, spoke up unexpectedly. "Mrs. Wellington is a good woman, Mason. If she's offering, you should go." There was something in Mrs. Chun's tone that made him pause, a rare kind of trust she didn't give easily. Buddy, Oliver, looked up at him, his tail flicking as if he, too, agreed with the idea. Mason sighed. "All right," he murmured. "Just this once." Mason followed Margaret quietly as she led him out of the restaurant. The night air was freezing, but inside him, something unfamiliar stirred, something he couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the surprise of a stranger's kindness, or maybe it was the feeling that, for the first time in months, he wasn't alone. Oliver, the cat he had grown used to calling Buddy, walked close by, his tail swishing lightly with each step, as if he too understood that tonight marked a new beginning. Mason reached down, running his fingers through the cat's fur, now softer after Margaret had brushed away the dust of the streets. "I guess you win, kid," he muttered, trying to hide the small smile tugging at his lips. Margaret led him to a house nestled deep within a quiet neighborhood. It was old, but not cold or intimidating. There was something strangely warm about it. The porch light cast a soft glow on the freshly fallen snow, and the reflections in the windows reminded Mason that he was still here, that he still existed. "Come in, Mason," Margaret said as she opened the door. Her voice held no pressure, no insistence, just a simple invitation. He stepped inside, unprepared for the wave of warmth that followed. The crackling of a fireplace, the faint scent of peppermint tea and books, hundreds of them, lining wooden shelves in perfect order. It wasn't a palace, but it was something else. It was a home. Oliver leapt from Mason's arms and onto the couch. curling up as if he had never belonged anywhere else. Mason stood frozen in place, afraid to move, as if breathing too hard might make the entire scene disappear. "You can stay tonight," Margaret said gently. "No strings attached, just a warm bed and a meal." Mason wanted to refuse, to say that he was used to sleeping in train stations, used to the hunger and the cold, that he didn't need anyone's pity. But just as he opened his mouth, Oliver suddenly jumped down, rubbing his head against Mason's hand as if to reassure him. Mason blinked. Something tightened in his chest. "Just for tonight," he murmured, not sure if he was speaking to Margaret or to himself. Mason woke up in the middle of the night. At first, panic gripped him. It was too quiet. No screeching tires. No distant footsteps of other drifters moving through the night. His hand instinctively reached for his backpack. His body tensed, ready to run. But then, he felt something warm curled up beside him. Oliver. At some point during the night, the little cat had climbed into bed, curling into a bright orange ball against the soft white blankets. He stirred slightly, then let out a quiet purr, as if to tell Mason that it was okay, that he was safe. Mason blinked, sinking back into the pillow. A shaky breath escaped his lips. For the first time in a long while, he slept deeply. The next morning, Mason woke to the faint scent of toast and coffee drifting through the air. He pulled on his worn jacket, stepped out of the room, and found Margaret sitting at the kitchen table, flipping through a stack of papers. "Good morning," she said without looking up. "Black coffee or with sugar?" Mason hesitated. He wasn't used to mornings where someone asked him things like that. "With sugar." Margaret nodded, poured a cup, and slid it across the table as if this was just a normal routine in her home. Mason stared at the steaming mug, then glanced over at Oliver, who had leapt onto the table and was now rubbing his head against Margaret's shoulder with an easy familiarity. He cleared his throat. "Yesterday, thanks," Margaret smiled. "You don't have to thank me, Mason, but there is something I'd like to ask." Immediately, Mason tensed, his instincts kicking in, the defenses he had built over the years rising automatically. "What?" She set the paper down, folding her hands together. "Would you like to stay longer?" Mason's heart skipped a beat. "You trying to send me to a shelter or some program?" "No." Margaret shook her head. "Just an offer. I run a foundation that helps homeless youth. I could help you get your paperwork in order, get back into school, even find a job if you wanted." He let out a sharp, humorless laugh, his voice colder than he intended. "Why would you do that?" Margaret met his gaze directly, her voice steady. No pity, no condescension, just quiet patience. "Because I believe everyone deserves a chance." Mason said nothing. Oliver suddenly jumped onto his lap, rubbing his cheek against Mason's hand as if urging him to think it over. Mason stared down at his coffee, then glanced out the window. Winter was still there, cold, relentless. But inside this house, something felt different. A part of him wanted to say no, but another part, the part that was exhausted from fighting alone for so long, wanted to say yes. He ran his fingers gently over Oliver's head, listening to the soft, trusting purr. "I'll think about it." Margaret smiled. "Take your time." Mason had never believed in second chances. Life had taught him that nothing came for free, that every bit of help came with strings attached, that promises were just empty words swept away by the wind. And yet, he stayed. One night turned into 2, then a week, then a month. Margaret never pushed. She didn't impose strict rules or demand stories about his past. She simply let things unfold at Mason's pace. And maybe, just maybe, that was why. Slowly, carefully, he started to let his walls down. One winter morning, Mason sat in the kitchen with a cup of black coffee. He had gotten used to it, no longer needing sugar, when Margaret pulled out the chair across from him. "There's someone I'd like you to meet," she said. Mason frowned. "Who?" "Claire Matthews. She's the legal specialist for the foundation and the best at helping kids like you regain their legal identity." Mason immediately tensed. "What do you mean?" Margaret remained patient. Do you have any form of identification? Silence. It had been so long since the name Mason Johnson had meant anything on paper. No ID, no birth certificate, nothing to prove he existed. When he ran away from his uncle's house, he had left it all behind, partly out of fear of being tracked down, and partly because he thought he'd never need it again. You can't work legally without proper identification. You can't apply to college or even open a bank account, Margaret continued. Claire can help you fix that. Mason sat in silence, deep in thought. He didn't like this idea. It felt like being pulled back into a system he had spent so long trying to escape. But then, Oliver, the cat that had become his constant shadow, suddenly leaped onto the table, sprawling out over the stack of documents Margaret had prepared. He looked up at Mason, his bright green eyes seeming to say, "It's time, buddy." Mason sighed. "All right, I'll meet her." Claire Matthews was a woman in her early 40s, polished in appearance, with sharp, perceptive eyes that carried the weight of experience. But unlike the social workers Mason had met before, she didn't look at him with pity. She just looked at him as a person, nothing more, nothing less. "We'll start with whatever you have," Claire said, spreading out a stack of paperwork. "Do you have anything? A birth certificate? An old ID?" Slowly, Mason reached into his backpack and pulled out a small plastic bag, the one thing he had always kept with him. Inside was an old library card, a crumpled photograph of him with his mother, and a scrap of paper with the address of the house he had once called home. That was all that remained of his past. Claire examined them and nodded. "That's okay. We'll build from here." She didn't make grand promises, but step by step, she helped Mason reclaim his legal identity, applying for a new birth certificate, obtaining an official ID, and even re-enrolling him into the education system. And strangely enough, when Mason finally received his new ID card, with the name Mason Johnson printed clearly across it, he felt like a part of himself had come back. A name, a presence, a piece of a life he had once believed he no longer deserved. Margaret never said much, but she had a way of guiding Mason in the right direction. One day, she placed a folder in front of him. "GED classes," she said. "If you want a future, this is the first step." Mason flipped through the pages, reading about the program. He had once been a good student, before everything fell apart. He still remembered the nights spent buried in textbooks, the quiet pride of seeing a high score on a test. But after years of surviving on the streets, could he really catch up? "You're smart, Mason," Margaret said, as if she could hear his thoughts. "I believe you can do this." So, he signed up. Mason's mornings were no longer just about black coffee. They were now filled with textbooks, tests, and study sessions. He quickly realized he wasn't falling behind. The knowledge was still there, buried but waiting to be awakened. But even as life slowly settled into something more stable, the ghosts of his past refused to let him go. Mason still kept his backpack packed and ready in the corner of his room. He still stockpiled protein bars and a few cans of soda in his dresser, as if, at any moment, he might have to run again. He knew Margaret noticed. She never said anything, never questioned him, never tried to change him, but he noticed that the kitchen cabinets were always stocked with snacks, that Margaret never locked the fridge, that she never once asked him to unpack his bag. And he knew Oliver noticed too. Every night when Mason found himself staring at his backpack like it was his only escape, Oliver would jump onto the bed, curling up beside him, pressing his warm fur against Mason's side, as if to say, "You don't have to go anywhere." And while Mason wasn't quite ready to believe it yet, he didn't push the cat away either, because maybe, deep down, he wanted to believe that this was home, even if just a little. The days at Margaret's house slowly changed Mason. He didn't hoard food in his backpack as much anymore. The nightmares came less often. For the first time in years, he began to think about the future, one that didn't involve park benches or running every time a cop looked his way. But the ghosts of his past had never truly disappeared, and on one bitter February afternoon, they finally came for him. Mason was at the front desk of the support centre, organising paperwork, something he had volunteered to do after realising he had a knack for structure and organisation. He didn't like talking to too many people, but this job made him feel useful. The bell above the door chimed, and as Mason looked up, his entire body froze. The man standing there was a figure he knew too well, a shape carved into his worst memories. The coat was neater, the posture more composed, but nothing could disguise the way he walked, the barely restrained aggression in his stance. Mason knew those eyes, filled with anger, with control, with the same threat that had haunted him for years. His uncle. "There you are." The man's voice was low but sharp, cutting through Mason's thoughts like a blade, slicing straight into the past he had tried so hard to bury. Mason's fingers curled into a fist, his nails digging so hard into his palm that they nearly broke skin. "You have no right to be here," he said, his voice rough with a mix of fear and anger. His uncle scoffed. "You think you can just run forever?" The man sneered. "I'm your legal guardian. I have every right to take you back home." Home. Mason almost laughed. The place where he had to sleep with one eye open, afraid of when the next hit would come. The place he had fled just to survive. He shook his head, not in response, but to push away the flood of memories threatening to consume him. And then Claire appeared. She didn't need to ask questions. She didn't need context. One look at the scene in front of her, and she understood everything. "Sir," she said, her voice calm but firm, "you are not allowed to be here. This is private property. If you don't leave immediately, we will call the police." Mason's uncle's eyes narrowed, his temper flaring. "And who the hell do you think you are," he snapped, "to interfere in my family's business?" Claire didn't flinch. "Family," she repeated, her gaze icy cold. "Abuse is not family. Violence is not family. And Mason is not a child anymore. He has the right to decide his own life." Mason had never seen anyone stand up for him like that before. In the past, every time he was hit, he had told himself to stay silent, to endure, because no one cared. But now, standing in front of him, blocking him from the nightmare of his past, was a woman willing to fight for him. And it wasn't just Claire. Margaret stepped out of her office, followed by 2 security guards from the centre. She didn't say much. She simply crossed her arms and stared down at Mason's uncle like he was nothing more than dust on her floor. "You have 2 choices," she said, her voice quiet but filled with undeniable authority. "Leave right now or be escorted out." Mason's uncle clenched his fists, his body vibrating with anger, but he knew he had lost. He muttered something under his breath, something bitter, something ugly, but then turned and stormed out, the door slamming shut behind him. Mason stood frozen, his whole body trembling, but not from fear this time. No one spoke for a moment. Then Margaret gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "You okay?" she asked softly. Mason swallowed, blinking against the dizziness clouding his mind. I don't know." "Then just breathe," Claire said. "No one can force you to go back there. Ever." Mason looked at the 2 women standing in front of him, one who had given him a home, one who had protected him without hesitation. And then his gaze drifted downward. Oliver was still there. The little orange cat sat quietly at his feet, his fur rising and falling with every soft breath. He hadn't run away. He had stayed. Mason knelt down, picked Oliver up, and pressed his face into the cat's warm fur. He didn't have to run anymore. Not ever again. That night, after everything that had happened, Mason sat in the living room of Margaret's house. The fire flickered in the hearth, its light dancing in his eyes, but his mind drifted somewhere else, back to the past, back to where he had started. He hadn't expected to stay here this long. At first, it was supposed to be just one night, then a week, then a month. And now he realized something. He had a place where he belonged. A place where, every morning, he no longer had to wonder if he would be kicked out. A place that, against all odds, felt like home. Margaret sat down beside him, placing a cup of hot tea in front of him. Oliver, as always, jumped onto his lap, curling up as if to remind him that no matter what happened, he wasn't alone anymore. Margaret watched him for a moment before speaking softly. "Mason, I have a proposal. He raised an eyebrow, waiting. I want to adopt you. Mason froze. Margaret continued, her voice steady, not rushed, not demanding, just a simple, genuine offer. Not to put you back into the system, not to force you into anything you don't want. I just want to officially be your family. I want you to have a name, a home, a real home. Mason stared down at the cup of tea in front of him. He thought about the years spent on the streets, the cold winter nights, the times he told himself he didn't need anyone, that he could survive on his own. But now, someone wanted him, not out of obligation, not out of responsibility, but because she truly wanted him. Oliver nudged his head against Mason's hand, as if encouraging him to believe again. Mason took a deep breath. His voice caught in his throat. I never thought I'd have a family again. Margaret smiled gently. Family isn't just where we're born, Mason. Sometimes we have to choose it. Mason looked up at her, then around the room, the warm glow of the fireplace, the blanket Margaret had bought just for him, the books on the shelf that had once been empty. He had once believed he didn't deserve a home. But now, as he met Margaret's gaze, he realized something. He didn't have to fight alone anymore. Mason swallowed, his heart pounding in his chest. I agree. Margaret smiled, this time warmer than ever. She gently placed a hand on his shoulder, no words needed. And in that moment, Mason knew. He had truly found home. Not long after his adoption, Mason began to think about how he could help others. One day, while assisting Margaret at the foundation, he noticed a boy, maybe 14 years old, walk through the doors. His clothes were worn, his eyes wary, his entire posture tense, like he was ready to run at any second. Mason looked at him and saw himself. He remembered the nights he had wandered the streets. He remembered wishing someone would reach out a hand, and now he had the chance to be that person for someone else. That evening, over dinner, Mason looked across the table at Margaret. I want to expand the foundation, he said. She set down her fork, smiling. Tell me your plan. Mason took a deep breath. I want to start a program specifically for homeless teens, the ones who don't want to go into the system but can't keep living on the streets either. Margaret nodded. And how do you want to help them? Education, Mason said without hesitation. I know how much learning can change someone's life, but not just that. We could teach them life skills, independence, how to build themselves back up. Margaret leaned back in her chair, pride shining in her eyes. That sounds like an amazing plan. Mason glanced down at Oliver, who was perched neatly on the chair beside him. A new idea sparked in his mind. And there's one more thing. Margaret raised an eyebrow. What's that? I want to start a pet therapy program. She looked surprised, but didn't interrupt, waiting for him to explain. Mason reached down, gently scratching behind Oliver's ears. You know, if it weren't for him, I'm not sure I would have made it through everything, he admitted. I believe there are so many people out there like me. People who just need something to hold on to, someone to trust, even if it's just a little stray cat. Margaret chuckled, a warm, knowing sound. Mason, I think that might be one of the best ideas I've ever heard. Mason smiled, a real smile. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living with purpose, a family, a future, a mission. And it had all started on a cold winter night, with a small meal shared with a stray cat. Mason never thought he would set foot on a college campus. For most of his life, the future had been nothing more than a distant concept, something meant for people lucky enough not to worry about food, shelter, or where they'd sleep that night. But now, as he stared down at his GED diploma, he realized he was more than just a survivor. He was building a new life. Congratulations, Mason! Margaret's voice was full of warmth, her eyes shimmering with pride as she looked at him. Mason blinked, glancing down at the diploma in his hands, a symbol that he had made it through, that he had pushed forward, fought for something he once believed was out of reach. His fingers tightened around the paper, as if afraid it might disappear if he let go. I did it, he whispered. Margaret nodded. You did. And this, she gestured toward the diploma, is just the beginning. And he knew she was right. A few weeks later, Mason held an envelope in his hands, his acceptance letter to the University of Chicago, a degree in social work with a minor in non-profit management. Mason had never imagined himself in college, but when Margaret had asked him what he wanted to do with his life, the answer had come easier than he expected. Teenagers with nowhere to go, kids who didn't want to return to the system but couldn't survive on the streets forever. Mason wanted to create a path for them, a path he wished had been there for him. And to do that, he needed knowledge, he needed skills, he needed a strong foundation to turn his vision into reality. So Mason stepped into college, not as a lost soul, but as someone with a mission. When he wasn't in class, he spent most of his time at the Wellington Martinez Foundation, the new name of the charity after Margaret had officially adopted him. Even now, as he looked around the foundation's office, it still felt surreal. A year ago, he had been sleeping on cold benches, unsure if he would even make it to the next day. But now, he sat behind his own desk, drafting plans to expand programs that helped homeless youth. One morning, Margaret placed a folder in front of him. I think it's time for you to start your own project, she said. Mason frowned. What do you mean? Margaret smiled. The youth support program you mentioned. This is a draft plan that I had our legal team review. Do you want to make it a reality? Mason opened the folder. The pages were filled with legal terms, financial plans, and development roadmaps. His heart pounded. He looked up at Margaret. You really think I can do this? She tilted her head, her gaze steady and unwavering. I don't just think so, I know you can. Mason swallowed, adrenaline coursing through his veins. There had been a time when no one had believed in him, but now someone didn't just believe. She was giving him the chance to change the world in his own way. I'll do it, he said, his voice steadier than ever. Margaret smiled. Good, then let's get started. No matter how much life had changed, one thing remained the same. Oliver was still by his side. The little stray from that winter night had now become the unofficial mascot of the foundation. He had his own bed in the office, where he spent his days curled up, lazily watching Mason and his team work. Whenever Mason got too stressed with projects, Oliver would jump onto his desk, sitting right in front of him, his bright green eyes staring intently, as if to remind him, relax, it's going to be okay. Mason chuckled, running a hand through the cat's soft fur. You know, buddy, I don't know where I'd be without you. Oliver closed his eyes and let out a low, content purr. Mason had never believed in fate, but he did believe in this. Oliver hadn't just saved him that winter night. He had given him a family, a future, a purpose. And now it was Mason's turn, to use his own life to help others, to be the person he once needed, to give someone else a small miracle, just like the one he had found on that cold winter night. Mason used to think birthdays didn't matter. For years, while living on the streets, the day he was born was just another number, another day that passed unnoticed, uncelebrated. But this year was different. This year, he woke up in a warm room, sunlight streaming gently through the window. On the nightstand beside his bed, there was a small gift box, and on top of it, a familiar card, written in neat, careful handwriting. Happy birthday, Mason, Margaret. Mason held the card in his hands, a strange, unfamiliar feeling swelling in his chest. This was the first time someone had remembered his birthday. Oliver jumped onto the bed, curling up against him, purring softly. Mason smiled, running a hand through the cat's soft fur. Yeah, buddy, he whispered. It's my birthday. But he didn't know that today wasn't just any birthday. That evening, Margaret took Mason to the office of Patricia Rodriguez, a lawyer he had worked with many times through the foundation. But tonight, she wasn't here with just any documents. Tonight, there was a special file sitting on the desk. Mason, Margaret said, her voice gentle yet unwavering, I want to officially adopt you. Mason's head snapped up, his eyes wide. Margaret smiled. I know you've been a part of this family for a long time now, but I want to make it official. I want you to have a home, not just in your heart, but on paper too. Mason looked down at the documents in front of him. The words blurred as a wave of emotion crashed over him. No one had ever fought for him before. No one had ever wanted to call him family. And now, someone did. Not out of obligation, not out of pity, but because she truly wanted him. His voice cracked as he swallowed hard. I don't know what to say. Margaret reached out, taking his hand, her gaze filled with patience and love. All you have to say is yes. Mason bit his lip, his chest tightening as a lump formed in his throat. Finally, he took a deep breath and picked up the pen. He signed his name, and with one stroke of ink, Mason Johnson, once a boy with nowhere to go, no one to call family, finally had a home. Margaret placed a hand on his shoulder, her eyes shining with pride. Welcome home, son. 2 simple words, but they hit Mason harder than anything he had ever felt before. Not long after, Margaret called for an important meeting at the foundation. Every staff member was present, and as Mason walked into the room, he couldn't shake the feeling that something big was about to happen. Margaret stood, holding a piece of paper in her hands. Today is a significant day, she announced. Not just because we've officially welcomed a new member into our family, she turned to Mason, smiling, but because we're taking a major step forward in our mission. The room fell silent as everyone listened. She continued, as of today, our organization will have a new name, the Wellington Martinez Youth Foundation, to honor the people who helped build it and the young lives it will continue to support. A round of applause erupted. Mason looked around, his heart sharp pounding in his chest. Then Margaret turned back to him. And Mason, I want you to officially join the leadership team. His eyes widened. Me? You have lived through what so many kids out there are facing, she said. You understand their struggles better than anyone. I want you to help us expand our youth programs, develop the education initiative, and lead the pet therapy project you started. Mason blinked, feeling like he was in a dream. He thought back to that cold winter night, when he had been just a homeless kid, alone in a dark corner of the city. He remembered the moment he shared his last meal with a tiny stray cat. And now, just over a year later, he wasn't just surviving anymore. He had become someone who could change lives. He looked down at Oliver, who was now perched on the table, his tail flicking gently, as if waiting for his answer. Mason took a deep breath and smiled. I'll do it. That day, as Mason stepped out of the office, the Chicago sky was strangely clear. He lifted Oliver, holding him close, feeling the warmth of his small body against his chest. You know what, buddy? He whispered. We've come a long way. Oliver responded with a deep, contented purr. Mason looked up at the city before him, the bustling streets, the towering skyscrapers, the flickering lights reflecting in his eyes. He knew that out there, beyond the crowds and the noise, there were still so many kids like him, lost, searching, hoping for a chance, for someone to believe in them. And now, Mason was ready to be that person. A family, a future, a purpose, and it had all begun with a small meal shared with a stray cat on a cold winter night.